Hi, this is Chris Jensen, as you may know if you're in my class, and I'm recording this short video here for my students in the spring 2016 evolution class. We had a week where I had to go away for an hour and do a guest lecture, and that kind of cut some time out of our normal time together, so we never got to really go over this activity, putting adaptations to the test. So I'm going to quickly go over different answers here. I'll be indexing this on the learning management system for you, so you can see where your feedback is, so you don't have to listen to all the feedback if you don't want to, but it will all be there if you're curious, and you can see online the different traits that each group had to do. So just to remind you, this task was I gave you a trait, some of them are pretty bizarre, and asked you to think about three things. So the three things you had to think about is, first of all, how might this trait be an adaptation? So what aspects of this trait make it adaptive? The second was to tell an evolutionary story where you could explain how such an adaptation might arise through the processes of evolution. And then the third would be to test that adaptive hypothesis by some sort of experiment or other kind of test. So this is a tough assignment. If you don't know a lot about these organisms or even a lot about evolution, this is a tough assignment for you, but it's something I wanted everyone to struggle with. And there were some really good things that were said by members of the class. So in no particular order, I'll go over first. This is Alex, Helena, and Amelia. They were given the lock and key insect genitalia, which they called damselflies in distress. And basically, this characteristic is kind of interesting. Different insects have different types of genitalia, and the genitalia are specific to each species. So each species, the male and female genitalia fit together in lock and key, and this prevents members of different species from mating, even if they happen to get together and attempt to mate. So the question is, why would that be an advantage? And this group had some good ideas about this. They said by excluding other species, it controls the chance of variation for a particular species. Flies that are more similar may be able to reproduce more quickly and efficiently. So we talked about this a little bit in class, but the really important thing here is that if you avoid mating with members of the other species, you also avoid wasting your gametes on what would either be an inviable, or even if it's viable, a not so well adapted hybrid offspring. So they have a pretty interesting kind of story. They say once upon a time all flies had the same genital compatibility, but then something went horribly wrong or right. Some random mutation produced genitals at different sizes and shapes. So this makes sense. There had to be some mutation. It would have to be mutations or mutations that would affect both female and male genitalia in these species. And so then, the advantage has to be there that members of the species who are able to only mate with each other have an advantage over members of other species or their own species that can mate with whoever and produce sort of wasted offspring here. So they have a test here that they're thinking about here. They say acquire a large amount of damselflies, introduce predators into control environment, track the ones that survive to observe genital changes over generations. So this seems a little indirect to me, and I think we need to really think more about the predictions we'd make here. So the predictions that we would make from this hypothesis is that having genitalia that are specific to your species would prevent you from wasting your gametes on matings that don't work. So I like a lot of these experiments work well if there's some sort of arena kind of experiment where you let things unfold. Sometimes this doesn't work because evolution takes a long time and you can't always evolve things during the time periods that an experiment would take. But you could get different insects that are closely related to each other, some with lock and key genitalia, some without. You maybe would have to modify their genitalia to take away the lock and key aspects of it. I don't know if that would be possible. I think the more important prediction to test here is that individuals who have lock and key genitalia are going to produce more viable offspring in the next generation than those that don't. So you might want to mix a variety of different species together and see how well they do based on how specific their genitalia are to their own species. The prediction you'd have there would be that the more specific the lock and key genitalia are for that particular species, the more likely that species is to actually successfully produce, or members of that species are to produce lots of offspring. So this is a tough one, it's a weird one, and really relates to speciation, right? Because the idea of a species is it is an isolated gene pool, and having lock and key genitalia is one way to make sure that your gene pool remains isolated, and that could be good if hybridizing is bad for the fitness of your offspring. Alright, so second one here, this is Sana and Shannon. they got bioluminescence. So a lot of deep sea dwelling organisms have bioluminescence, and there's lots of different places they could end up taking this, because there's actually a variety of ways that bioluminescence can be used. But they actually were looking at both from this perspective of acquiring a mate and from the potential value of attracting prey. So you can kind of trick prey by flashing little lights in the dark, and the prey think that that's maybe a mate, or some other, maybe they think it's their own prey, and then they come and they get eaten by you. So they did both. I'm actually going to focus on the prey one because it's kind of an interesting one here. So they say, move a group to an environment with more light to see if the anglerfish, that's a species that has this like light that it uses to fish or to hunt with, can still attack its prey when visible and when the prey is not adapted to seek sources of light. It's a little unclear here, but I like the general idea here, which is that, again, you maybe want to do an arena experiment. The prediction of this hypothesis is that having this light gives an advantage for predation. So you'd want, if you could, this might be hard with some of these deep sea fish because they're hard to keep in captivity, but let's assume that you could, you might want to actually test whether or not this light actually helps them. So you'd want to create a dark environment in some sort of laboratory that's somewhat like their home environment, and then you'd want to make the light an advantage or non-advantage. So certainly you could do that by creating differences in the light background. So you could make more background light, which makes the actual anglerfish light less of a prominent signal, and see whether or not anglerfish in that arena. This is kind of what I call an arena of death experiment, where you have predators and prey, and you're going to see how many of these prey get eaten. So the prediction would be that the more that light signal is able to be used, the better the predation rate of the predator. So you could do that either by obscuring the light, by putting some sort of cover on it to make less or more light, or you could, as they suggest, increase the amount of background light, which kind of effectively makes it so that the light used to lure their prey is not as effective. So either of those could work. So they had some really good ideas on here. I think the key factor here is, okay, what am I predicting? What's the prediction of this hypothesis? They'll be better predators. Okay, how do I test that they'll be better predators with the use of this bioluminescence? Alright, third one here. Jocelyn, Yasmin, and Ricardo did camouflage cephalopods. So cephalopods are cuttlefish, octopi, and squids. And they have a really good idea here that being able to camouflage yourself allows you to be a more efficient predator. So similar to the bioluminescent predators, this is a way of becoming more efficient this way by hiding from your prey as opposed to attracting them. And they had some good ideas that if they say before cephalopods developed camouflage, they had trouble catching prey. Prey would see the cephalopods before they were able to see or attack them. This is probably true, although let's keep in mind that we'll learn more about this later. This is called coevolution. Probably the prey were not that good at detecting the predators, but as they got better at detecting the predators, that put more pressure on the predators to be camouflaged, right? So there would be evolution of both predator detection on the prey's part and camouflage from prey on the predator's part. So these things probably went together, but I like this idea that this basically helps them to better hunt. And this actually gets down to the really hard question of how do you do this when you have a species that's already evolved this characteristic and you can't easily remove it. So it's kind of hard to remove. They say remove the camouflage gene from some cephalopods. Well, the problem, as we've talked about before, is it's not that easy to just know what gene actually causes camouflage. And the reality is probably there's a whole suite of genes, tons of genes that would have to be turned off to effectively remove camouflaging. So I like this idea. If there was some biochemical way, maybe it's not about turning genes off, which is a little bit more of a higher level process or higher level manipulation. Maybe we can do something, inject something into their bloodstream that doesn't harm them, but that neutralizes the pigments that they use. I mean, if there was some manipulation there, then we would do a similar experiment where we would predict that when the camouflage opportunity is taken away, we predict that they would be less successful at hunting prey. So again, you'd have an arena of death experiment with some poor prey items floating around in the enclosure, and you would be able to count how many of those prey get eaten based on how much camouflage the predator has. The other option would be to create environments in which the camouflage background would be more or less valuable. So you can imagine some environments allowing for the camouflage to be used more effectively, other ones not. Maybe you could use variations in environment, and you predict the more effectively that the cephalopod can camouflage against the background, the more likely it would be to be able to actually successfully hunt down its prey. So a lot of these come down to like, okay, you want to establish the benefit. If the benefit is being a better predator, you actually have to have some evidence, some observations of predation being better with this particular adaptation. With all these, the big problem is if you don't have variation, it's hard to test how something's better. If every cephalopod is able to camouflage, you have to somehow create artificially the condition of not having that characteristic. All right, Paige and Jesse had an interesting one. They had one called sand dollar duplication. So these sand dollars are interesting. They're kind of they kind of have like a flexible means of reproducing. So normally they reproduce sexually. They make a smaller number of offspring and their sexual reproduction, and then those offspring slowly develop over time until they get large enough to become full adults. But if they are in a larval stage and they detect predators through smell in the water, so there is smell in the water, chemicals in the water, animals can detect those. So I guess it's not smell like we do through air, but it's still scent. Basically then the predator's scent triggers them to clone themselves, so they don't bother trying to find a mate, they don't bother trying to actually grow to full size, they just quickly make lots of clones of themselves. Now obviously that slows down all of their clones from becoming adults because they basically have taken their body mass, divided amongst a bunch of clones, which now have to take more time to grow up. But the question of what value is there to that, and they have a good sense here that this potentially helps them survive against their predators. They're not totally clear on how. I think the really important thing here is this kind of quality versus quantity question, and this comes up for lots of species with their offspring. Species that have lots of predators on their offspring make lots and lots of eggs, right? And species that can protect their offspring from predators make fewer eggs. And so there's this question of whether you do here. The sand dollars can kind of do either, and this is what's called a plastic response, right? They can respond to their environment depending on what it is. So they say hypothetically a primary species of sand dollars were constantly preyed upon, this is their evolutionary story, resulting in little growth until a mutation occurred in which one or few sand dollars were able to clone itself. As a result, a copy of itself was eaten, and the remaining sand dollars were able to pass on the cloning gene. So I think they have the right idea here. So by cloning yourself, you have a better chance of passing on your genes, even if it's slower the way you do, because you just avoid the ultimate horrible thing of having yourself eaten and not being able to pass on your genes. So the ones that were able to clone, even if after they were eating, are still able to pass on their genes to their clones. So this group clearly understands the benefit here. So then they have this idea, to test our hypothesis, we need to separate larvae with the ability to clone from those without the ability to clone. To do that, we have to take a selection of larvae from a controlled environment and release only the scent of a predator. Those who cloned will be separated from those who cannot. So they kind of are pre-screening. Well, this would work. So I like this idea. Like, if there is variation in like how much these different members of the species do or don't clone, this works. The problem is that what if cloning is so great that all the members of the species, all members of the population already do this? But let's assume this can work. And then they say we would then replicate the process with the two separated populations, so one that can clone, one that can't clone, and this time introducing an actual predator. So this is kind of a pretty clever experiment. They are first screening using this predator scent to see whether or not they have some variation in the population. And if they do, then they're seeing if these variation would lead to how much they survive. So they said the percentage of surviving larvae would then determine the survivable rate of the gene. I think they need to be a little more clear on this. I mean, what they really should say is that if the prediction that cloning is an advantage is true, then, or that hypothesis is true, then we would predict that larvae that clone themselves, that population would have a better chance of surviving into the next generation in the face of predators than ones that don't. So they have a really good idea here. Just make sure when you are stating your prediction, you sort of state your hypothesis and then what the prediction is, because that's really that's the money thing that you want to accomplish with these kinds of exercises. But that was a good one. Emily, Jennifer, and Christina had ant-mimicking spiders. They had a lot of good ideas about these ant-mimicking spiders. So these are spiders that look a lot like ants, and they quickly seized upon the idea that enables the spider to get closer to prey on ants more easily, making it easier to eat and survive. Right? So it makes sense. If the ants don't recognize you as a predator, they think you're another ant, then you can eat them better. So their story is there may have been a group of spiders who had one spider who resembled an ant. That spider was able to survive because of the ant-like appearance, made it seem less threatening to ants, allowing it to prey on them more easily and survive to breed. other ant-like spider offspring. That's a pretty vague story. We might want to add to the story, like, you know, is it initial mutation about color and it looks the same color as the ant, and then that one is more able to prey on ants. This would have to be a progressive story, wouldn't it? Because looking like another species is not something that happens overnight, so it would have to be steps. Maybe one of the things these spiders have is they have their seventh and eighth legs, right, are held up on top of the front of their bodies like antennae, so that they really are walking on 6 legs like an insect, like an ant, and then they kind of hide their seventh and eighth legs as antenna. So maybe that's the key adaptation. They're both colored and look like the ants, so like we might want in our story to make more clear that it would be progressive. We don't know what order it would happen in, but progressive mutations could make these spiders more and more capable of hunting the ants. And remember, just a slight change, like being more colored like the ant, if that gives you a slight advantage over the ones that are different than the ants, anything that does something to camouflage you or to trick your prey is going to give you an advantage. And so we can understand these stories of how you get to be really sophisticatedly similar to your prey, to mimic them, by understanding that every little step along the way could be a benefit. And then I have this interesting idea. So there's a bunch of different species that do this. So there's like an Indian mimic spider in Thailand. And there's ants. Basically, there's spiders in Thailand and spiders in India that both do this. And this group had a really interesting idea. They said, well, okay, we could take spiders and their prey and flip-flop them. So you would have Indian spiders with Indian ants, you'd have Thailand spiders with Thailand ants, and then you would do the flip-flop. You'd have Indian spiders with Thailand ants and Thailand spiders with Indian ants. And they're not as clear with their prediction on this, but hopefully you can see what the prediction should be. That prediction should be that they should do much better hunting. Again, another arena of death experiment here. They should do much better at hunting prey that are from their same region, because they've evolved to better mimic the look of those. So I thought that was an ingenious way of looking at this from this group. Moving along here, we got 3 more. Probably the hardest one. So Ethan, Lissa, and Sky had carnivorous plants. So carnivorous plants are super weird, right? I mean, most plants get all of their nutrients from one of 2 places, or from 2 places. They get a lot of nutrients from the soil, and dissolve water in the soil, and then they get the rest of the nutrients from doing photosynthesis by making carbohydrates. And so, you know, this is kind of an interesting one, because these plants actually eat, dissolve, digest, and absorb nutrients from insects usually. I mean, there are a few species that actually take things larger than insects, but mostly it's insects. And so, you know, they had some really good ideas here. One thing that they picked up on that I think that was smart was that these plants really only exist in places where there are low nutrients. And so the adaptation is that you can survive in a place you couldn't survive because the soil has low nutrients if you can get nitrogen, particularly as a nutrient, from hunting. This is one of the hardest ones to tell a story with, right? I mean, how does a plant go from just being a plant to starting to eat insects? So they struggle with this. It's not that easy. I think to tell a good story here, you need to start with where they come. You start with where they end up, and then move along. This is much easier for pitcher plants. So pitcher plants are a series of plants that have some sort of nectar in the bottom of them and a little pool of water, and then insects kind of go looking for the nectar because they smell the sweetness, and they end up falling into this water, dying, drowning, and then there's some digestion going on in that, and then it's absorbed into the plant. The one that's really hard is the Venus flytrap, right? I mean, this is a plant that actually has like a hair trigger designed on it to snap closed and capture insects, and that one's a lot harder to do. So I'm gonna leave that one alone a little bit. I mean, the challenge on that one, I won't leave it alone completely. If you want to tell an evolutionary story about a Venus flytrap, you have to figure out how might this work without the trap before you end up getting a trap, because it's just the trap only works if it's fully functional. And this is one of the arguments that people who question evolution often bring, like, how do you get something highly sophisticated like a Venus flytrap, where like you have these leaves and there's a hair trigger on them, and when an insect flies it collapses on them? I mean, how could that just like suddenly spontaneously evolve? It's not going to evolve from like one mutation. So I think we don't know on the answer to this question, and that's not uncommon, but I think what you'd have to appeal to is that perhaps these species used other means before they developed these sort of trap versions. So perhaps these species were kind of sticky before, so any species that had a little bit of stickum on its leaves would be able to like trap insects, and if those insects dissolved or digested or decomposed, and then that decomposed insect ended up in the soil and could be absorbed, that would be an advantage. If, in addition, eventually another mutation came along that allowed some of that dissolved insect to actually directly be absorbed by the leaves and used as nutrients, that'd be a second adaptation. And then eventually, if that stickiness was also, increased the ability to trap insects by having these kind of fingers, and if you look at the edge of Venus flytraps, they have fingers on them, that would be valuable in an adaptation that would allow them to further capture insects. And then, at some point there has to be this adaptation. I don't know enough about this to fully know, but my guess is that this is probably a good example of an X-adaptation. Leaves do naturally move, and they move to get to light. They can also have movement in relation to other factors. So I think this must have been some kind of co-opting of a way of moving, but it's very rapid. So that's a tough one. The ones that are pitfall traps, these species that actually capture insects, the pitcher plants, that is a lot easier to understand. I mean, if you imagine that there's a leaf that already is collecting some water, which might have a previous adaptation, any plant that then was able to trap insects, so maybe some of its sugar is leaking out into there by some mutation, and then insects get trapped in there, and then that would allow for more nutrients. So this one is the hardest one to tell a story about, but if you think about successive steps that could happen, that's one way of doing it. In terms of testing this, it's really hard to test because unlike some of the other ones, you can't really like neuter these. So I would actually focus on really the value of this, and so they didn't get deeply into this, but they had some ideas on this. They say send scientists out into the field and count the number of different plants, and these pitfall traps and these trapping plants that are out there. They say test nitrogen and nutrient levels in these areas, and then they don't quite close the loop on that. So like, if you were to send scientists out to like see where do these plants exist that are carnivorous, and how does that correspond with the nutrient levels, I think the prediction you want to make is that these plants thrive in areas where there's low nutrients, and that shows you that that's probably a good evidence. It's indirect evidence, but indirect evidence that this is an adaptation to low nutrient levels, and I think that's what's been found. So that's probably the toughest one. So sorry, Ethan, Sky, unless you had a hard one there. The last two are my Botox ones, so I'll tell you about those. Mark, Grace, and Jake had alligator lungs. This is a really cool adaptation. So apparently fairly recently discovered was the fact that there are muscles that attach to the lungs of an alligator and allows the alligator to manipulate the location of this inflated lung within its body cavity, which is a lot like in fish. Fish have something called a swim bladder where they can fill it with gas, and they manipulate the amount of gas in there to manipulate their buoyancy. In this case, it appears that alligators have this really fine-grained control where they can move their lungs around in their body cavity, and that allows them to sneak up at the bottom of the water and have these little eyes that are just sort of looking out there. Their body's in a perfect position so that when there's some prey comes along, you can attack very rapidly without being detected. So they had this idea. This group was right on this here. The one thing that's interesting is they talked about being able to better reproduce due to being able to sneak up on their prey. But a couple of groups had this problem, like, should definitely make it clear, like, okay, so if I'm better able to catch my prey because of an adaptation, more food means I can make more offspring. And this is particularly true for animals like alligators that lay eggs. Probably what limits the number of offspring for an alligator is just like for female alligators, how much food can you eat and how many eggs can you pump out, right? Because that's probably what's going to be the big limiting factor. So it is clearly for predation is a good hypothesis here, but you want to connect that to more successful reproduction by making more offspring. So you say in order to test the tactical effectiveness of the muscles, that mount to the lungs for hunting, we'd inject the muscle with Botox to paralyze the muscles and examine how that affects the ability to hunt prey, the ability to return to using their legs and tails for hunt, or inability could lead to how the muscles evolved in order to mask their movement in the water. All right, this is a little vague. I mean, to me, so just a couple clarifications if you're not in this group. Basically, Botox is a bacterial toxin that paralyzes the muscles of vertebrates, and so you can use Botox to manipulate. And it's nice because it is something that's temporary, so like unless you inject it into a muscle like the heart that needs to function all the time, it basically paralyzes the muscle for a period of time. This is why people use it on wrinkles, because if you have wrinkles like I do, if you wanted to get rid of them, which I've given up on worrying about, then you would inject something into your the muscles around your eye, this Botox, and it would paralyze those muscles, and then it kind of makes everything smoother. So it is because of your muscles that your wrinkles show better. So this can be done, again, how much this is humane is really kind of a matter of perspective, but we're not so much worried about a humane test, we're really worried about making a test that would work. But it seems to me like you need another arena of death here. We need to have prey running around with alligators, and some alligators have been partially paralyzed with this Botox, and does that actually affect their ability to sneak up on prey? So this would be a hard experiment to do, maybe an impossible one, but at least we can imagine. We would predict that if these muscles that attach to the lungs are valuable for hunting, then paralyzing them should reduce their efficiency at hunting. And to do that, we'd have to have a pretty crazy arena where we have prey running around, alligators have the chance to ambush the prey, and see if alligators that are temporarily paralyzed do worse. So that was an interesting one. And my other Botox group was Aaron and Annika, and they had eel double jaws. So this is an interesting adaptation. Eels are pretty voracious predators, and apparently some of them have had these jaws that are sort of a secondary set of jaws. So their primary jaws, and then nested inside them are this secondary set of jaws that are sort of behind. And the idea is that when they strike a prey, the prey goes partly into their mouth, and there's a second set of jaw that really grabs onto the head, and then the outside jaws are grabbing onto the rest of the body. So this group really had a good sense of what was going on here. So they say this trait allows them to grab their prey with their front teeth and then restrain it with their esophagus. That's kind of cool. So they see the clear advantage. And they think that this initially emerged as an exaptation, a process in which new and old genes take on new functions. The secondary jaw may have emerged from a developmental mutation occurring in the first jaw, or more likely as a result of multiple mutations over many generations. Because this trait was so beneficial, eels who possessed it were more likely to survive and reproduce until the trait became ubiquitous. So again, I'd love to see this connection. Better predator, more food, more likelihood to leave more offspring. So that's the only thing that wasn't clear, but otherwise a really nice explanation. And this actually, so there is this idea in evolution of what's called hopeful monsters. And this idea of hopeful monsters is sometimes maybe there is a major developmental mutation. And these are interesting because we'll learn more about this, but because of the way the the way that development happens, a small mutation could cause a big scale mutational change, especially like something like a duplication of a body segment. And so this is essentially, the second jaw is a duplication of a body segment. And so if there was this like mutation that changed where the genes for jaws are expressed along the body in development, it could create these second jaws, and if they actually were somewhat valuable, then this could become a trait that would be really quite valuable for hunting. So what do they say? They say if we can prove how beneficial the secondary jaw is, we can infer that eels who possessed it were better able to survive and reproduce. We could do a controlled laboratory experiment in which we test the eels at feeding time based on size of the fish they're able to grab and consume. So that's kind of interesting, like how big a fish can I take? Can I take a bigger fish, which is an advantageous take if I have this extra jaw? One group would be tested with their normal traits, and the other would have their secondary jaw paralyzed by Botox injection. Clearly, I was running around in class talking about Botox, but it's a good thing. This came from the students, right? If it came from you, you said, well, I want to somehow make the jaw not work, and then I said, well, there are ways of paralyzing muscles. If the eels with both of their jaws functioning are able to catch and consume a larger amount of fish, then they're better equipped for survival. So that's nice. That's like a clear prediction. The hypothesis says this makes them better predators, therefore we predict that if you paralyze them, they should be worse predators, and if you leave them unparalyzed, they should become better predators. So this was a nice job on the part of Aaron and Annika. Alright, well, thanks for listening to this. Sorry that I had to do it this way, but I had fun making this video for you, and that's all I have to say. Have a good day.